No, you don't need a pen tonight. I was asked by an usher who will remain nameless, but it was Ken Hamby, um, asked he said, no papers tonight? I said, that's Wednesday night, Ken. He said, you got me so trained now, I don't know what Sunday or Wednesday to ask for papers to hand out. And so, no, Wednesday night's when you'll get your notes, folks. So, well, as we get started tonight, we will take whatever prayer concerns you may have, and we will get those into the bulletin for next Sunday. And so, any of those prayer concerns you have at this time. So, any that you want to share, Michael? Okay, that's good. So remember Nathan. Oh goodness. Good. Okay, we got him, and need to remember Stacy with the doctor's visits and potential uh, biopsies and things. And so remember Stacy. Any others? Michael Bentley. All right. Remember Michael Bentley. Any others? Tanya? Okay. And and Frank's last name again? Eckert. All right. Remember the Betty Lell family and Frank Eckert. Any others? All right. Any others? Remember Shona Winstead? She's home, but still has a long road ahead of her. So, is somebody? Sue? Patsy Evans? All right. Remember Patsy Evans? Any others? Okay. And what was the first name? Jerry. Okay. All right. All right. Remember Judy. Any others? Not that that's not a list full, but any others? All right. Well, we will be sure to get those into the bulletin. We have a couple of praise reports, I guess you would say, if you want to call it that, or celebrations. You know, as I try to remind us regularly as a church family, we celebrate, we grieve together, we do all of those things together. And yesterday, as most of you know, Ray and Ladon's daughter Alexi and her now husband Tyler were married yesterday. But also earlier this week, Grant and Alta celebrated 60 years of marriage. And so that's great. I told her, I said, some people don't even live to 60. And I said, y'all have been married that long. That's great. And that's exciting. And today is Nate and Terry's 29th wedding anniversary. And Nate had texted me this morning and said, embarrass her this morning and mention it during the service, you know, during the announcements. And I told him I was more scared of Terry than I was of him. And so I was watching for her. And I saw Nate in the choir, and I'm looking. I'm like, where's Terry at? Where's Terry at? And she was in the nursery. I said, you hid in the nursery, so I couldn't call you out this morning. And she's like, yeah. So she didn't really say much on that. But they've been married for 29 years, and Natalie had a birthday this week, so she turned 28. So she's she's doing well. So anyway, we are in Genesis chapter 4 tonight. We're gonna look at the entirety of Genesis chapter 4. But usually when we read Genesis chapter 4, we sort of highlight or focus on the story of Cain and Abel. And so that's going to be the first part that we talk about. But in this book study of the book of Genesis, or at least the first 11 chapters, we're looking at everything. We're not picking and choosing and leaving anything out. And so we'll be doing that. Again, also, I want to remind you or encourage you more than anything that as we go through this study, be sure, as I've asked you to try and do, as a part of your daily Bible reading, read a chapter between Genesis 1 and 11 repeatedly. One chapter a day for 11 days, and then rotate to the next Genesis 1 and start back over again throughout the whole study, because this repeated reading of the text, even though it may be ones that we've already looked at or ones that we're going to be looking at, it builds familiarity with the text, and you'll start to see things that you might not have picked up on the other times that you've read it. So I would encourage you to do that. And so tonight we are picking up with Genesis chapter 4. We're going to look at verses 1 through 16 first, which is the story of Cain and Abel. And so I'm going to read those to you as we get started tonight. And we're going to read verses 1 through 16. You can just follow along in your Bible, and then we'll break it down and what it has to say. And so it says, beginning in verse 1, it says, Adam lay with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord I have brought forth a man. Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? The Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. But the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And so we read these first 16 verses of Genesis chapter 4, and we read this story of Cain and Abel that is so well known. But we aren't told exactly how much time has elapsed from the time that Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden to the point that these events are being read. Now, most likely it wasn't long after their expulsion from the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve started their family. And so we're told in this text that their sons, Cain and then Abel, are born. And we're told about the difference between the two boys, that we're told that Abel raised livestock, which makes him the favorite already, okay? I'm sure he had awesome-looking cows, but I'm sure that's inferred by the scriptures. But anyway, but then we see that Cain is one who raised crops, whatever those may have been. But nevertheless, verses 3 and 4 tell us that both of them brought offerings. Both of them would bring offerings from what they had raised. And Cain is said to have brought some of the fruits of the soil. Notice that, some of the fruits. And while Abel brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. And so, as we're going through this study, there's times that we have questions about what's going on in the text. And one of the questions we would have right now is, what is the difference between their offerings? What makes them different? And as we see in a little bit, they're regarded as different. One is accepted and one is not. So what is the difference here? And it really is the quality of the offering or the approach to their sacrificing. Because as we read, Cain gave some, and Abel gave the fat portions of the firstborn. He was given the cream of the crop. Abel was giving the best that he could, and Cain over here is just giving some of what he had. And so Abel seemed to do that. He seemed to give the very best of what he had, and Cain seemed to give minimally. Sort of like, well, how much can I get by with giving God? And he doesn't smite me here, at the offering altar. He's sort of like, what can I get by with the very bare minimum? Anybody have kids like that? The one, you got one that might go above and beyond, and the other's like, just give me enough to pass. Just let me have enough to. I'm not speaking from experience, but nevertheless, that's what we see in Cain and Abel. Cain's just like, let me do the bare minimum, and Abel's like going above and beyond. And so we aren't told exact. Well, let me ask you this. This is another question. Why were Cain and Abel even giving sacrifices to God? Why were they making sacrifices? This is another question that is raised because, Genesis 1 and 2 is creation. Genesis 3 is the fall in the garden, and then Adam and Eve get the boot from the garden, and there's not a whole lot of talk about worshiping God. There's talk about walking with God and fellowshipping with God, but not worship. And so why did Cain and Abel make these sacrifices? Now, in the Scriptures, we're not told because, again, that timeline is not filled in for us on what their backstory is in regards to that, as to why they were given offerings. But Bible scholars seem to think that most likely they learned it from Adam and Eve, who learned it from God when God had to make them coverings of animal skins before sending them out of the garden. We talked about that last time that we were together for this study, that was a sacrifice that God had to make to cover their sins, and the symbolism there and things like that. Well, that could have very well have been God's first opportunity to show mankind, Adam and Eve, what it meant to sacrifice and to worship Him through sacrifice. And so by doing that, Adam and Eve would have learned it from God, and they in turn would have passed it along to their children. So what we see here is, though, that God rejects Cain's offerings and He accepts Abel's. And again, we see that the quality and the attitude of the offering makes a big difference. And so we read in the text here that Cain is bothered by the fact that God doesn't accept his offerings, and God tries to counsel Cain. He tries to help him on how he was responding to God's rejection of his offering. And God told him, He said, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? So that tells us right there in verse 7 that there was something wrong with the way Cain was doing his offering. He said, because if you'll do it right, there's not a problem. So that implies that he was doing it wrong. There was something wrong about it. And then God says, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Again, as we talked about last Sunday when we were talking in the morning worship about eternity past. In eternity past, God knew this conversation was going to happen. He knew that in that moment, Cain was not going to choose to do what was right, that he was going to choose to murder Abel. And who? Cain? Well, Adam and Eve taught them, but just because mom and dad teach us doesn't mean we always do what's right. So God would have told them directly. But it goes back, and you make a good devil's advocate point here on this. There's a good point to that too, because we see the same thing happening in Genesis chapter 3 when Eve goes and tells what Adam told her about the fruit in the garden. So you got to remember, there is a flawed communication error here with, God is communicating correctly and perfectly with His creation, and then they're the ones messing it up. Adam messes up with Eve as to what fruit is acceptable or whatever the directions he gave her were, and then Adam and Eve have taught Cain and Abel, and so they've taught them what was right, we assume, and if Cain and Abel were both taught correctly, then obviously Cain is taking it upon himself to not do exactly what was right. So we can tell from the scriptures that he knows what was right, or he had been taught what was right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few moments. So God encourages Cain to do what's right and not allow sin to sort of overcome him. And so as we know in verse 8, it tells us that Cain invites his brother Abel. He lures him out to the field. And what we read about is how he attacked him and killed his brother. And so another question that comes up in the midst of this is, what did Cain use to kill his brother? Do you know? A rock. That's what we always hear, but it's not told to us in Scripture. That's what we assume it was. But we don't really know. But that is the thing that people always say, well, Cain, killed Abel with a rock, but we don't know that for sure. But we know that he does that. And then when Cain is confronted by God with, after this has happened, God asks him the rhetorical question of, where is your brother at? And, Cain lies about it and then says, am I my brother's keeper? I heard that from one of my boys the other day, and I thought, yes, you are. Just where is he at? That's all I wanted to know. I didn't want a smart aleck answer. And so I asked him, I'm like, and yes, I'm easily distracted at times. And so there's a lot feeding through with this whole Cain and Abel thing. I'm just glad my boys, don't hurt each other. So no, anyway. So what we see, though, is that that Cain, when this goes on, Cain, God calls Cain out on his sin. He calls him out on it. And, Cain is not taking responsibility for his own sin. And that's very reminiscent of what Mom and Dad did in Genesis chapter 3 when God said, why did you eat that fruit? Or who gave you that fruit? Or who told you that? And Eve, Adam's like, that woman that you gave me, I'm not taking any responsibility for it. And Eve's like, that serpent, that it deceived me. And, well, it makes you wonder how if Adam and Eve, because of the way that stories and family histories and things are always passed down verbally, and we share stories about grandparents and parents and things they did, and I could tell you about some of the things my grandparents did, and one thing and another. Well, we have these oral traditions that are passed down. You wonder if Adam and Eve, when talking with Cain and Abel as young men or young boys or as they got older to be adults, you wonder if they're like, why can't we go back over here where y'all used to live before we were born? And they're like, well, here's what happened. And they tell about not taking responsibility for their own sins. And then Cain is put in the position where he has to take responsibility for his own sins. And so we see a little bit of Abraham and Abimelech and Isaac and Abimelech here, that the sins of the father are sort of the same thing of the sins of the son. And so we see that same sort of thing is happening here, that Cain is following in his parents' poor judgment footsteps in not taking responsibility for his sin. And so what we see, though, is that God curses him, that God curses Cain because of his sin. And he does so in a similar way the way he cursed Adam and all of mankind after him. But it was only more severe for Cain, because Cain was made a nomad. He was made a wanderer after this, and he's sent out from the presence of God. And so we don't fully understand what that means, as far as, Adam and Eve were in the garden and were in God's presence, and they were pushed out of Eden, out of the garden. But then, there was something different about the presence of God outside of the garden where Adam and Eve were living, and Cain sees that as don't take this the wrong way, the physical area where manifestation, this was the place where God was located at. It wasn't a physical flesh and blood body like we think of with Christ, but it was this physical place near Eden, near the garden, that he made the connection. This is the presence of God. This is where God is. And so now you're making me this wanderer I have to go to the east of Eden. I have to go to this place called Nod here in a minute, as we'll see. And he goes there, and he realizes now that he's going to be out of the presence of God, whatever that looked like for them post-Garden of Eden. And so what we see is that area, Nod, was a place that means wandering or homelessness. And so for him, that's what it meant. He was going to be this homeless wanderer from now on, going into the rest of his life. And so before being sent out, Cain complains about his punishment. He's saying that it's just too much for him. And so he's worried that somebody might extract revenge on him for killing Abel and for him being killed. And we think, well, who's going to kill Cain? Well, it could have very easily have been Abel's sons. We're not told that he was married, but we're not told that he wasn't married. It could have been Cain's and Abel's brothers or their nephews that would have taken revenge on Cain for killing Abel. And so what we see is that God placed a mark on Cain that would keep people from killing him, that there would be something specific about seeing him in this way that would, with this mark, that would keep people from exacting revenge in some way, and because of what he did to Abel. Now let me ask you this. This is our next question from the text. What is the mark of Cain? We read about this and we see that God placed this mark on him, but we really don't know what it is. We don't really know what kind of mark that it was, but it was some sort of sign that God used to keep people from killing Cain. It was a visible representation on his body that when people saw it, they knew that they could not exact revenge. We don't know what that was, but we don't know. Some have suggested that it could be some sort of scarring, some sort of tattoos, or some sort of, something like that was a physical representation on his body in some way. But the sad thing is that some have used the mark of Cain for millennia now as a basis for their own racism, and by saying that the mark of Cain was a darker colored skin. And unfortunately, that's what some have used to perpetuate their own racism, saying that someone with dark colored skin follows that line of Cain. But there's a whole lot of we don't have any kids in here. There's a whole lot of stupidity in that for a lot of reasons, and the reason for that would one of those would be that the mark was only on Cain. It wasn't something that would be perpetuated through generations later. So it was something specific to Cain so that people wouldn't take vengeance on him, not on his children or anything like that, because God spoke specifically to Cain. But the other thing is Cain's line was eradicated with the flood. And the last time I checked, Noah's family was the only one that came through the flood. And so if there had been a continual mark on his family, they would have been wiped out eons ago with the flood. And so there's no way for us to know what the mark of Cain was, and there is no way for us to base it on anything related to a particular race or anything like that. But whatever the mark was, whatever that individual mark on Cain was, it served its purpose. Because we never read or never hear about Cain being executed, I guess you would say, or revenge being taken out on him. And so with that ends the story of Cain and Abel, but we know we have some more verses here that help us get a fuller view of what it looked like in that time. And so we got verses 17 through 24 that talk about Cain's descendants and those that would come after him. And so I'm going to do my best not to butcher some of these names. And if you want to take a shot at it, I'll be glad to let you if you think you can know how to pronounce some of these. But we're going to read verses 17 through 24 to tell us a little bit about Cain and his descendants. So follow along in your Bible. It says, Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehuel, and Mehuel was the father of Methushael, and Methushael was the father of Lamech. Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal, He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play the harp and flute. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. And so this is a brief snapshot of the line that comes from Cain shortly after he leaves the area where his parents and the rest of his family lived. And so in verses 17 through 24, what we see there is the first of 25 genealogies in the Bible. There are 25 genealogies spread throughout the Scriptures, and this is one. This is the first one. And so we read about this line of Cain going through 8 generations from Cain to Lamech's children. And so we see that it goes from Cain all the way down to those 4 children of Lamech. And we see that as we are reading this, that there is a city that is founded by Cain while his wife is pregnant. He's building this city, and he names it after his son, and he names the son and the city Enoch. Now, this is not the same Enoch who walked with God and then was translated to heaven, as we'll look at soon in another study. But what we can gather from this is Cain is, he's excommunicated from his family's area because he's killed his brother. And he goes and he starts building this city. Now, do you remember what we said the area of Nod was called? It was wanderer or homelessness. And so some Bible scholars believe that this was Cain, by building this city of Enoch, that Cain was trying to sort of circumvent this idea that he would always be a wanderer, that he was trying to put down roots so that he had somewhere that was not a wandering lifestyle, a wandering nomadic lifestyle. But regardless of what his plans were there, we see these different lines down to this man Lamech and his children. And we see that his sons were the fathers of herding, of music, and metallurgy. And so we see that those were things that they started to introduce into the world through their understanding of these different aspects of creation. And so Cain's family, the family line closes out here with an odd statement by Lamech where he says, Ada and Zillah, listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. And so he's basically saying that, hey, Cain was, God promised to avenge Cain 7-fold on those that would harm Cain. Well, it's going to be 77 for me because I've killed a man as well. Now, the question would be, again, another question for tonight's text, is why did Lamech say he would be avenged 77 times against anyone who killed him in revenge? Well, the Bible, again, doesn't give us much to go on here, but most likely it was just Lamech's way of putting that idea in people's heads and sort of giving him some coverage, giving him some protection, some insurance that people are like, well, I heard this about Lamech. God's going to... No, God never said that. Lamech said it. But the idea is it's sort of like those half-truths that get shared. Somebody hears it and they just run with it, and it perpetuates its own, story. Well, it's the same thing here. He has said it, people have heard it, and people will continue to share it, so nobody's going to mess with him because of that. But although God pronounced the oath of vengeance on Cain and, protecting him, Lamech pronounced his own. So there's not really anything to back it up. So it was really just idle chatter or an idle threat by someone hoping that no one would take revenge on him for killing someone. And so as we read this, though, the one last question we have for this section of the text is, where did Cain's wife come from? That's one of those questions that we get asked a lot of times when we read Genesis chapter 4. Because if there's Adam and Eve and Cain and Cain, because Abel's gone, then where does this other person come from? And although the Bible, again, doesn't tell us, we do know that there were limited amounts of people on the earth at that time because humanity was brand new. And the the understanding that Bible scholars have is that Cain would have married either his sister or one of his nieces. And so you have to remember, though, we think immediately, that's red flags for us because of marrying so close in kin in that way. But because of the fact that human genetics had not been degraded because of sin like it has to this point, humans, again, were fresh out of the box, so to speak. They were brand new. There was no degradation of the human genome in that regard, or genetics in that regard. And so sin had not had time to ruin the human population in that way. And so you got to remember, too, though, that this was God's original plan. God had Adam and Eve, put them in the garden, and said, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. Take care of the animals, and don't eat from that one tree. Well, they started doing good with 2 of those rules and then ate from the tree they weren't supposed to eat from. But what we see is that was God's original plan, was that Adam and Eve would have children and their children would have children. And so this was God's plan, regardless of how things played out. But sin would eventually cause problems with such close relations reproducing. And so we don't see that anymore. As something that goes on. Now, we've got 2 more verses, so look at verses 25 and 26, and we'll be done for the evening. It says, beginning in verse 25, it says, Adam lay with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son, and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. And so, we move from Cain killing Abel to Cain's family line we move back to the line of promise, the line that leads from Adam all the way to the Messiah, to Jesus. And so we see that God blessed Adam and Eve, and they had another son named Seth. And Seth was now the one who the line of promise would go through. And so he would be the one that would lead to the Messiah through that family line. And we see that it goes one step further and tells us that Seth had a son named Enosh. And so we see that the line is continuing. But then the chapter closes out with this interesting statement, this interesting phrase there. It says, at that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. And that would be our final question for the biblical text tonight, would be, what does that mean? What does it mean for people to be calling on the name of the Lord? And it's pretty much what you would think that it would be, what it sort of sounds like. Because what that means is, in verse 26, it shows us that people from Seth's line, Adam to Seth to Enosh, and heading on down, eventually to Noah, and then from Noah's family to Abraham, and from Abraham to David, and from David on to Jesus. But what we see is that Seth's line began to gather for corporate worship, just like we're doing tonight, just like we did this morning. And not only that, they were also seeking God's help. They were praying. They were calling on Him for help. They were asking Him to help them in their life, but they were also not only worshiping on an individual or family basis, but more as a corporate worship. So there were parents and grandparents. There were grandchildren. There were children in the mix as they were coming together to worship and worship together. And so that's the end of our study of the text, but as we know, there's a couple other things that we're going to look at before we wrap up, and one of those is the first. We always talk about the first things that we see in the book of Genesis for creation, mankind, human history, the Bible, all those things. And some of the first, there's a lot in this particular chapter that we saw. We see the first child. We see Cain. We see the first sacrifices are made to God. We see the first murder. And with the first murder, we also find the first death. We also see the first grandchild. And, you see the first grandchild, and that makes me remember what my parents have said. They said, if we knew how good grandkids were, we'd have skipped having kids and just went straight to the grandkids. I'm like, gee, thanks, Dad. So evidently grandkids are all the rage. But nevertheless, yes, they are. Okay. So we have the first grandchild. We have the first city in the history of the world, and it's called Enoch. We also see the first genealogy. We talked about that a few moments ago. And then we see the first time that people called on the name of the Lord. We see the first time that people were actually, now Cain and Abel were making offerings to God, so they were obviously worshiping him, but we see this corporate worship and this real understanding of what prayer is in that moment. And so, as we said, each chapter that we look at, we're going to try and pull from that something that, as it sort of throws back to Genesis chapter 1, what was the good? You know, God saw his creation and said it was good. So what was the good in chapter 4? And so the good we find in Genesis chapter 4 has to do with how people can worship God and seek his help despite the chaos that families sometimes endure. You know, Adam and Eve, there's no debating it. Adam and Eve ruined everything for humanity by introducing sin into the world. There's just no two ways about it. That's what happened. But what we see is that they still taught their children how to worship God. Even though Adam and Eve got it wrong in the garden and sinned, they still taught their children what it meant to worship, sort of like we were talking about a minute ago when Keith was asking that question. But, you know, Cain and Abel knew what it meant to worship God, and they knew what it meant to worship God right, as we talked about a moment ago. They knew what it meant. They knew how to worship God through those sacrifices, even if Cain didn't do as he was taught. You know, Cain was taught just like Abel, this is what it means to sacrifice, and Cain was given some, and Abel was given the best. And so we see that Cain, even though they were both taught what it meant to worship God, Cain just, for whatever reason, chose not to give like he should, or not to sacrifice like he should. And so even after Cain killed Abel and Cain is banished from God's presence, what we see is that Adam and Eve continue to teach their children what it means to worship God. And the way that we can tell that is by the time Seth is raised, and by the time he has children of his own, we see that Adam and Eve's descendants are continuing to worship God. They're calling on the name of the Lord. And so even though Cain didn't get it, Abel did and is no longer in the picture, Seth and his line is continuing. And as we know from the genealogies that we read, Adam had other sons and daughters and lived for this many years. That's the way the genealogy always reads in Genesis. But we know that those other sons and daughters would have been taught the same thing as Cain, as Abel, as Seth. And so we see that, more importantly, they are not just worshiping him, but they're worshiping him corporately, collectively, as a group, and they're calling out to him for help. And so what we see in this is that despite the messiness of life and how chaotic things can be for families sometimes, we can still teach our children what it means to worship God. Just like Adam and Eve did, and just like Seth did with Enosh and on down. You know, Abel and Seth got it, but Cain didn't. And that's not Adam and Eve's fault, because if they taught them and they were worshiping and Cain decided, well, you know what, I'm not going to worship the same way I'm supposed to, and I'm going to do my own thing. Is that on Adam and Eve, or is that on Cain? That's on Cain. And so does it mean as parents and as grandparents that we will get it right all the time when it comes to helping our children and our grandchildren move forward in a life of faith? No, we won't always get it right, but the blame is not all ours. The responsibility that we have is that, you know, we need to do everything we can to teach our children what it means to worship, what it means to have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and then live that out and model that for them. And so if we teach them and we explain it to them and we model it for them, if they don't get it, it's not our fault. And I'm not trying to say, you know, anybody's passing blame or anything like that, but if we teach them and we model it for them, we cannot do any more, because we cannot make those decisions for them. We have to lead them as far as we can, but you know the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so it's our responsibility to do everything we can to model it and everything we can to teach it and do everything we can to reinforce it with them, in the hopes that, you know, as they make their own decisions, that they will cling to the faith that we have had, that we've passed along to them. And so it is up to us to do everything we can to make sure that they have the knowledge, the tools, and everything that they need to make the right decisions when the time comes. And as that time comes, it's their decision to make. Because honestly, how many of us would make the decision for our kids to follow Christ? We'd say, yes, that's what they need. That's what they want. Yes, we would make that decision for them. But then who's making the decision? We are, not them. And so then that's not a relationship that they have with Christ. It's our relationship being forced on them. And so that's the hope, is that we would help them make the right decisions by leading them in the right direction. And so as we finish up our study tonight, as always, I want to try and leave it a little time for questions. So are there any questions about tonight? Other than Alta, any questions? No. No, go ahead, Miss Alta. Yes. That's a good observation, and I think that could potentially play into it. I think that it's one of those things, until we get to heaven and ask that specific nuance of the question, I don't know that we'll know that, but it does make sense, because like you said, everywhere else there's the shedding of blood for the remission of sin. Well, he could have traded some of his crops for what his brother had, and then used that to make his sacrifices, like he had been most likely taught by his mom and dad, who had been taught by God. And so that very well could have been the case. And like we read there, God says, if you do what is right, won't you be accepted? And so obviously there was something wrong with the way he was doing that, and that may very well be it. I didn't read that in any of the books, that as far as in any of the commentaries, that was the argument for why God didn't accept it. It was always more along the lines of, he knew what to do and he didn't do it. It was sort of the attitude of his heart. If I put $5 in the offering plate, and it's a true sacrificial giving for me, because I don't have but $6, and I give that $5 to the offering and trusting God for it, that's a lot different than somebody who drops $1,000 in the plate and doesn't even feel it, like we read about in the New Testament. So it's a matter of the heart, and I think that Cain's problem was his heart wasn't in it, and therefore, because his heart wasn't in it, he didn't make the right kind of sacrifice, as in the animal sacrifice, potentially. Yes, that's a good point. Is that it'll be all right, Cain. Just you can use that, something along those lines. I'm sure he was in Cain's ear regularly. One that's missing a couple rows of kernels, and one of those the worms ate through, and all that sort of. It may very well have been the case. Any other questions? Those are some good ones. Any other questions this evening? If you don't ask questions, that means I taught too well, and I know that ain't the case. Yes, ma'am. That married Cain, and yeah, I would probably say no, because Cain is the first one that they had. They couldn't have had any children before they left the garden, because Cain was the first one that would have. Because I think when you read the genealogies, that it goes back. The first one would have went back to Cain and Seth. Now I'd have to double check that, but it gives us the impression that he's the first one, so we would assume that he is. But it may. That's a good observation there. I hadn't thought about that. But in the what? Well, yeah, that may have been true too. He said maybe the first ones were daughters, and in a paternal system as the Jews had, they didn't count, so to speak. And that may very well have been the case. But I'll play the devil's advocate on your comment about childbearing. It could have been that God had told her that there wouldn't be any pain in childbearing originally, and she hadn't had any children, and now he said, well, guess what? Now there is going to be. So, it's one of those things. I don't think, because generally with the way they were so detail oriented in listing who was first, firstborn and one thing and another, that had there been others, even daughters, I think they would have been listed before Cain, and then they would have just went on and said, and their sons Cain and Abel, da 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 da. So good question again. Any others? Yeah, and we don't know why that is. That they had this one daughter, and actually, she's the first daughter mentioned in the Bible as well. I didn't think about that for tonight's study, so there was one more. But in this patriarchal society that they had, it was kind of very unusual for them to have listed her very, very early like that. So that's a good observation, Joanne. You get a gold star for tonight. Any other questions?